Tim Christie, over there, has been trying to persuade me to start off the proceedings tonight with a joke, and he gave me one or two of his own to try out. Well, I did try them out, Tim, on my family and my friends at work, and the reaction I got was one of great indifference. So, as I'd rather have the audience with me than against me at the start, I think I'll spare you all my joke telling. It's the way I tell them, I think. I'm afraid I'm no Marty Kane. I'm not here this evening to deliver a lecture. I'm here because I want to share with you the discoveries that I have made, discoveries that I think are important and that I hope you will find as helpful as I have. As Ray said, there is no dogma in theosophy, so I hope you will consider what I say and then accept or reject it as you feel is right. I've been interested in the subject of death and dying for a long time, and this may have something to do with the fact that from the age of 5 until my middle 20s, because of my father's occupation, I lived within the grounds of 2 cemeteries and a crematorium. In my childhood, the tolling of bells, freshly dug graves, funeral processions, all these things were normal, everyday events for me. In the midst of life, I really was in death. As I grew older, in my teens, I noticed that some of my friends were reluctant, to say the least, to come to my house, to see me, to have tea or stay the night, that sort of thing. And that caused me to think about death and what my attitude towards it was. When I later discovered Theosophy, it confirmed and enlarged my own thoughts on death. Theosophy teaches that there is no death. There is only change. Death is nothing but a disruption and a removal of energy. It's a transferring of energy from a lower centre to a higher one. Nothing dies. The soul, or the individuality, or the consciousness, whatever term we use, continues its existence when the body can no longer function. And it goes back to the conditional state from where we borrowed it in the physical plane. I'd like to read a passage from a book by Manly P. Hall, Death to Rebirth, where he compares the experience of incarnation to a diver in a diving suit, leaving the light and fresh air in which he's comfortable, and descends by lifeline to the bottom of the sea. The heavy diving suit is the physical body, and the sea, the ocean of life. At birth, man assumes the diving suit, but his spirit is always connected by a line to the light above. Man descends into the depths of the sea of sorrow and mortality, that he may find there the hidden treasures of wisdom. For experience and understanding are pearls of great price, and to gain them, man must bear all things. When the treasure has been found, or his hours of labour are over, he is drawn back into the boat again, and taking off the heavy armour, breathes the fresh air and feels free once more. Wise men realise that this incident we call life is only one trip to the bottom of the sea, that we have been down many times before and must go down many times again before we find the treasure. I'm going to go into the preparation we should all make for our death and life in the after-death states later on. I want now to have a look at why death is viewed by most people as a tragic event. There are not many people who, when told of the death of someone they know well, would greet this news with an uplifting of the spirits, or could say that, the liberation of the soul of so-and-so was a wonderful happening. I only know of one person who has reacted in that way when he was told of the death of a friend. A few years ago, a friend of mine died unexpectedly, and I went to the funeral, and during the service, there was going on pretty much what you'd expect, at a funeral. There was a lot of weeping, and a great air of sadness, and the feeling of gloom that was so strong you could almost touch it. Well, I was sitting in the congregation, and I was thinking about my friend Oliver, and I imagined him smiling, because that was how he came most easily to mind. And it suddenly seemed very urgent that I should send out happy, loving thoughts of light and joy to him. And I found myself saying things like, "Go to the light, Oliver. Be one with the light. Be free. Be happy." And I felt wash over me a feeling of well-being and peace. I rested in this feeling for a couple of minutes. I suppose it was about a couple of minutes. And then I felt someone's eyes on me in the congregation. And I realised that I was actually smiling. And this obviously seemed odd to the person looking at me. And I could tell that he just didn't think it was appropriate. So why is death viewed by most of us as a tragic event? Mostly for selfish reasons. Emotional love is what the majority of us feel for those that we're close to. And emotional love wants things for itself. It wants to be loved in return. It wants to be shown affection. It wants the presence of the beloved. And emotional love is not the same as true spiritual love, which is unconditional. When we grieve at the loss of a loved one, we are feeling very emotional. And really, we weep and mourn for ourselves. When the beloved dies, we have to look death in the face and realise that this fate awaits us too. We mourn the fact that we must die, and we're afraid of it because it is an unknown dimension. Death is the most familiar thing in nature to us, and it is the most feared because it is the least understood. Yet we are constantly dying and being born again. We die from the physical plane to be born again in the spiritual realms, and eventually we have to die to that, to be reborn as a baby. Coming into incarnation could be viewed as a death instead of a birth. It all depends how we choose to look at it. If we could only realise it, death is one of our most practised activities. We've died many times and shall die again and again. Here I'd like to quote from this book, Death, the Great Adventure, by Alice Bailey. The cycle in which we now live has seen the greatest destruction of human forms in the entire history of the planet. There has been no destruction of human beings. There has been no destruction of human beings. Just as long as our consciousness is identified with the form aspect, death will hold for us its ancient terror. Just as soon as we know ourselves to be souls, we shall no longer know death. We are apt to forget that every night in the hours of sleep we die to the physical plane and are alive and functioning elsewhere. We forget that we have already achieved facility in leaving the physical body, because we cannot all, as yet, bring back into the physical brain consciousness the recollection of that passing out. Now, I'd like to discuss briefly what happens to a person during the death process. Theosophy teaches that the human being is a ray or stream of consciousness known in theosophical terminology as the monad, which enwraps itself in vestures or vehicles in order to manifest itself on this earth plane for experience, because the ultimate goal of the monad is to be as fully a conscious being as the divine source from which it sprang, enriched, ennobled, and having gained wisdom. The human being is made up of what is called in Theosophy the sevenfold constitution. In Christian terms, this is threefold and is spirit, soul, and body. Theosophy breaks this down into a sevenfold constitution, which has a lower mortal part and a higher and immortal part. The mortal part consists of the physical body, the etheric body, which lies behind the physical and is the model for it, and the emotional or desire body, which we are constantly building up with our feelings and desires while in an incarnation. There is also a pranic body, a body of prana, or a pranic principle, which gives life and vitality, and this runs through all the bodies. We discard the lower mortal part of us at physical death. The higher part of us is known as the immortal triad of Atma, Buddhi, Manas. Atma is the divine aspect in the sevenfold constitution. It's the highest principle, and because it is the divine aspect, it needs Buddhi as its vehicle through which to express itself. Buddhi is the principle of discrimination and intuition, and it needs Manas, the mental principle or body, to express itself. So, what's happening is that we are unrolling or unfolding downwards or outwards. Atma and Buddhi in conjunction are what make up the monad, which in Christian terms would be the spirit. Manas, the mental body, has a higher and a lower part. The higher Manas is the reincarnating ego, or soul, which Christians would term the human soul, and it is this reincarnating ego or soul which is reborn on this earthly plane. The lower Manas, lower mind, joins with the desire body, and this is what we know as the personality. And it's also the pivot in the human being that can aspire to higher levels or go down and get caught in the lower emotional, material part of us. Let's now consider death from the point of view of the monad, the divine part of us. Throughout our life, in a single incarnation, we sleep every night to revitalize the body and wake up to a new day. If we expand the picture, we realize that the monad also seeks refreshment, and each lifetime lived is as a single day in an incarnation, and each death is as a night of sleep to the monad. There is a saying in Theosophy, as above, so below. Right, so having taken a brief look at the bodies or principles that make up a human being, let's now think about how they are affected by what we call death. The moment of death can come swiftly, as in an accident or murder, or slowly, as in a protracted illness or the aging process. But the same sequence of events takes place at the moment of death. Just before complete and full death occurs, there is a panoramic vision of the life we've just lived. Every emotion, every thought, every event we've experienced is reviewed. Just following this, when brain death is complete, generally speaking, we lose consciousness. The brain is the last organ to die, hence the panoramic vision is the last function. Then the dying person glides into utter peace, and the closing of all avenues of thought and feeling lead to an unconsciousness which is perfect and complete. This lasts until the hazy and vague resuscitation of partial consciousness in Kamaloka, or the astral plane. This is vivid for the man who's lived an evil life. It's slight for the average man, and virtually occurs not at all for the exceptionally good and spiritual man. But what does this mean? Well, Kamaloka is an actual locality, and it surrounds our earth. It's a semi-material plane and contains the astral shell and astral forms of beings who have died to the earth plane. During life, we build an astral body through our lower emotions and desires, and this energy has to dissolve or wear out in Kamaloka before the higher part of us can progress into more spiritual realms. Also, in Kamaloka, our There are advanced spiritual beings who have chosen to remain there in order to help humanity. The average man, when in Kamaloka, is either practically unconscious or in a state of shadowy, vague dreaming. The evil person, because of the strong attachment to earthly things and the material appetites, has quite an awakening in Kamaloka. There is suffering for such a person, not physical, but a horrible nightmare type of awareness which repeats itself with variations. This is brought on by their own actions and will go on and on until the astral energy they created has run down or dissolved away. The average person, one with a material bias, may have vague feelings that they're in a bad dream, but not very bad. Those of a more spiritual nature may be aware that such things exist, but they don't experience them. For the ordinary, decent man or woman, there is a far larger degree of suffering when alive than anything experienced in Kamaloka. The dissolving away of astral matter or energy that I spoke of happens to all of us in a greater or lesser degree. And when the process is finished, it's known in Theosophy as the second death. When this point is reached, we are stripped down to the real person, the reincarnating ego or soul, and this now enters Devachan, or heaven world. The experience of Devachan is, like that of Kamaloka, dependent on the nature of the person and the life lived. Unlike Kamaloka, Devachan is not a place, it's only a state or condition of being. For the person who lived a life based on principle and truth and spirituality and kindliness, the Devachanic experience is one of inexpressible spiritual and mental beauty and peace. Every aspiring yearning, every spiritual hope and ideal, every desire for brotherhood that the person had when alive and could not for various reasons fulfill, find their opportunity for expression in Devachan, and the soul is filled with relatively perfect glorification of all the highest and best that it hoped to do on the earth plane but couldn't. Devachan is the condition of consciousness in which the excarnate soul rests, wrapped in the most beautiful and spiritual dreams. It is a state of bliss. So we might ask ourselves, is there a Devachan experience for the soul of an evil person? Well, if there should be enough good to merit a Devachanic rest, then it gets the precise measure of what it has in it to produce a Devachanic peace. And then it returns to incarnation and to its karma. If there is not enough good to produce a Devachanic rest of even a short duration, then it returns to the material life from which it was really unable to separate even after death. And again, karma awaits. I hope you will appreciate that this is a brief account and a very simplified account of after-death experience, and it is given in general terms. As every person has a different and unique life experience, so every person's experience of dying and the after-death states will also be unique. When I was researching for this talk, I came across a book called Life Between Life. It's written by a Canadian psychiatrist called Joel Witten and Joe Fisher, a reporter. Both were interested in reincarnation, and through his work with the patients he hypnotically regressed to earlier lives, the psychiatrist became more and more interested in experience that they'd had in the bardo, as the Tibetans call it, that state of existence between incarnations. What I found particularly interesting was the recounting of nearly all of his patients of facing a panel or board of spiritually advanced and wise beings who were loving and compassionate but firm, and who helped the soul before them work out for itself the plan of the next incarnation, for the best use of the next life. This panel varied in number from 3 to 7 usually, and were described in different ways, but the essence of it was basically the same. This is a very interesting thought to ponder on. Theosophy teaches that we choose our own circumstances of life for the purpose of learning necessary lessons, and when we are able and can look at our lives with different eyes, we can see how our various experiences have come about and the reason why. The whole of our lives should be a preparation for death. By living the spiritual teachings, we are preparing in the best possible way for death. By practicing letting go instead of holding on, by practicing meditation and non-attachment, we are preparing for death. When Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated, he was strolling in his garden. As he was shot and fell to the ground, he was heard to say, "Ram," God. He was so much with God in his everyday life that God was automatically a part of his death. And this is how we should all aim to be able to meet our own death. There is a question we need to ask ourselves, and this is, am I prepared to die now? Not, will I be prepared to die in 10 years' time, or 6 months, or 6 weeks, but right now, because we never know when our turn will come. We're not all going to live to a ripe old age. I could die tonight of a heart attack or whatever, and so could any of you. So it's best to be prepared. Up until recent times, women didn't realise that they could prepare for childbirth, and they were really rather ignorant of the whole business. Consequently, childbirth was, for most women, a painful experience which was dreaded. It was struggled through with physical resistance and gritted teeth, and that's how many people die today, and it doesn't have to be like that. What changed the experience of childbirth was that women could, if they chose to, have control over what was happening to them. Nowadays, women can be taught various techniques, and this also brings an understanding of what's going on, and this means less fear. As there is a technique for birthing, so there is also a technique for deathing. I'm going to talk about the deathing technique from 2 points of view. That of those preparing themselves for death, and that of those who want to help and support the one who is dying. Now, I can't go into all the exercises in detail because of the time limits, but there are books available, and I recommend this one, Deathing, by Anja Fuss-Graber, which does go into a lot of detail. An interesting and worthwhile book to read is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And Alice Bailey's Death, the Great Adventure is a marvellous work and a must for anyone interested in the subject of death and dying. In the back of Deathing is a long list of books and organisations all to do with death and dying, and anyone interested can have a look at my copy afterwards. For those preparing themselves for death, it's important to have as much control over the mind as possible. A disciplined, controlled mind that is able to maintain concentration will be of great benefit in the dying process and after-death states. We can all start improving our mental abilities by several methods. Serious study of a subject we're interested in, one that stretches the mind and really makes us think for ourselves, is very useful. Mental games like crossword puzzles, chess, Scrabble, all these mind games keep the mind well-oiled, so to speak. Meditation, and regular meditation, is an invaluable practice, both for living and for dying. I'm not going to go into the hows and wherefores of meditation, as there are plenty of books available on the subject. Earlier on, I spoke of the panoramic vision we experience just before complete death. In her book, Practical Occultism, Madame Blavatsky recommends all students to review the day's events and thoughts before going off to sleep at night. This should be done for two reasons. Firstly, because to do this accustoms the mind to consider one's life as a field of action involving our own responsibility, and secondly, because it builds into the mind a habit of mental review, thus making the panoramic review at death far easier and more quick and complete as regards self-conscious realization of the events that are passing before the mind's eye. Breathing exercises are helpful. A slower, more deliberate breathing than we normally use induces a quiet mind and calms anxiety. In the dying process, breath control will help in the withdrawing of the consciousness from the body and in relaxing and the letting go of the body. Breathing exercise can be practiced in conjunction with meditation. Another aid is visualization. Learning to visualize or improving the ability to visualize will be very helpful. Like everything else, this takes practice. The aim here is to be able to hold in your mind the picture of a holy or revered being to fix your thoughts upon, so that when death comes you will be able to do this, having become familiar with the exercise. At death our final thoughts are powerful things, and I've heard it said, but I don't necessarily agree, that one's last thoughts will decide one's next incarnation. I had a friend who was knowledgeable about spiritual teachings and practice, and I remember we were discussing this subject once, and she remarked to me that as she was a great lover of chocolates, she hoped her last thoughts wouldn't be of a Mars bar. Well, she died about 18 months ago, and I hope her last thoughts weren't of a Mars bar too. Lord Krishna mentions last thoughts in the Bhagavad Gita, the song Celestial. He and Prince Arjuna are talking together on the battlefield, and they're discussing life and death and the spiritual path. Krishna says to Arjuna, "Think upon me only. He who casts off the body and goes forth thinking upon me only at the time of the end, he enters into my being. There is no doubt of that. In the time of forthgoing, with unshaken mind fixed in devotion by the power of yoga, drawing together his life breath in the centre of the two eyebrows, he goes to the Spirit Supreme, Divine." This is in the 8th discourse. In this book, Deathing, the author gives a name to the technique of calling or invoking the help of a high spiritual being as we die. She calls it the fail-safe technique. And she says that this is one way to attain liberation and be delivered from the wheel of rebirth, by consciously thinking of and calling on a high spiritual being as you pass from the earthly plane of existence. In esoteric writings of the ancient wisdom, we are advised that to whisper a name of God into the dying person's ear will help them. I imagine that this would keep the withdrawing soul going in the right direction and fixed on the goal ahead. Now, although I think that this must be a good thing to do, I don't agree with Anya Fus-Graber, the author of Deathing, that we will not reincarnate again if we keep our thoughts fixed on an aspect of God when we die. Because if we read a little further in the 8th discourse, we find relating to this a further passage. Krishna says, "Having come to me, these Mahatmas come not again to birth, the place of pain, non-eternal. They have gone to highest bliss." Well, the important word we have to note here is Mahatmas. These are not the likes of you and me. Krishna is referring to spiritually advanced men when he uses the word Mahatmas, and as we are not Mahatmas, even if we could consciously fix our thoughts on Christ, Krishna or whatever at death, I don't think for one moment that this would automatically mean we would be liberated and enlightened beings freed from rebirth. We have our karma to work out and our lessons to learn. And although Anja Foos-Graber is quite convinced that the fail-safe technique will do the trick, I don't think it can be that simple. I still think you should go ahead and practice doing it anyway. I mean, take all the help you can get. Another aid in concentration is the use of a mantra. This is a simple, traditional device for slowing down the rapid movement of the mind. Apart from more technical considerations, a mantra is simply a word or phrase, usually of a religious nature. In the context of training to die, we will use the mantra as a tool in the work of controlling the mind. If it should help you feel closer to the divine source and raise you to a more spiritual level, well, so much the better. There are a lot of different words or phrases you could use for a mantra, and you should choose whichever you feel most attracted to. I'll give you a few examples of mantras that I like, so you'll have an idea of what I'm talking about. 2 Christian ones first. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And another one, be still and know that I am God. One from the Jewish tradition that I like, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Great. And one from the Catholic Missal, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord have mercy on us, Christ have mercy on us. This one and others you could use in conjunction with breathing practice and meditation. You breathe in, Kyrie eleison, you breathe out, Christe eleison. The Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, must be one that everyone knows, and there's a Hindu one I like because of the rhythm that's involved with it. Om Namaha Shivaya Om. I can't leave the subject of mantra without mention of the Gayatri, or King mantra. Gayatri means, that which rescues the chanter is this. And this is Shabda Brahman. The nearest translation of that is sevenfold divine sound. Anyone who is unfamiliar with the Gayatri will find it in any good mantra and meditation book, and there's a book on the bookstore next door called Gayatri. I've photocopied an extract from the book which gives some information about what it is and what it can do, and anyone who'd like a copy can have one from me afterwards. You can obtain a private and personal mantra which you would not divulge to anyone else, by asking your higher self if it would be possible for you to be given one during your meditation. And if you're lucky enough, and you do get one, obviously you would always use that as well as any others. Anyway, that's enough of mantras. If you know that your body has begun to die, and that your time is in the material world is limited, then it's essential to complete the business that you have with material concerns. All your financial affairs should be put in order. For instance, you should make a will and tie up all loose ends so there won't be any niggling worries at the last minute to hinder you. Get any funeral arrangements sorted out, remembering that saying farewell to the physical body may be important to those close to you, if not to you yourself. Esoterically, cremation is always preferable to burial. The tying up of loose ends applies to personal relationships even more than to material concerns. Try to resolve any difficulties in any personal relationships if possible. Problems here could be a real hindrance to you during the dying process and the after-death states. We should live like this anyway, but we don't. We let things slide, and up pops trouble when we least expect it, and when it's the last thing we want. So get straight is what I'm saying, in all areas of your life. Once you start consciously and deliberately preparing for death, you will improve the quality of your life. I'd like now to talk about what we can do to help another person who's dying. If we have decided to be a help and support during the dying and death of a friend or relative, and have talked over what this will mean, then the exercises and plans can be started. First of all, if the person wants to talk about what's likely to happen to them, we can discuss this honestly, to the best of our ability, and find out what we can from the medical profession for the final stages of the physical breakdown, and from esoteric literature for what happens to the inner person. For example, the doctor can advise on the levels of pain relief if it's discussed with him, so that he's aware that the dying person would prefer to die as consciously as possible. The supporter should be with the person when death occurs, to help ensure that there are positive thoughts and energies around their dying friend. Strong, positive support is vital at this stage. The helper may need to be a buffer between the dying person and close relatives who, because of their distress, may try to prevent the one dying from letting go by denial of what's actually happening. When the death moment comes, the helper should talk to the newly dead person by urging the soul, and please note here that once the death process has begun in earnest, we don't want the attention focused in the body. The consciousness will be trying to extricate itself from the body. So from now on we talk of the soul of so-and-so and urge it to go up to the light and be one with the light. We can now whisper a name of God, whatever was chosen, in the ear, to aid the soul in leaving the body. The supporter should say certain affirmations which have been practiced by both parties beforehand, such as, the soul of so-and-so and the Christ are one, or the soul of so-and-so is one with the light. The chief function now of the supporter is to guide the person up to the light, not down into the body. Phrases like, don't be afraid, be calm, be still, and the light and love of the Christ enfolds you now, repeated in a calm, firm, gentle voice, will be very valuable to the soul passing from one stage to another. Use the phrases that you've both practiced so that the disengaging soul will recognize and be familiar with them. Being a support person won't be easy. It's difficult to watch a person you love die, but you'll be doing that person the best possible service you could do. Keep tuning into the soul of the newly dead person for 3 times a day for at least 10 days, repeating the phrases or similar ones to the ones I've just mentioned. Remember to think of the person as a soul from the death on. If it would be possible for you to speak to the person conducting the funeral service beforehand, and ask him or her to refer to the dead person only as the soul of so-and-so and not just use the person's name, as I'm afraid they tend to, this would be helpful. You can give your reasons. Tell him that you do not want a connection enforced and retained with the earth life just ended. You can also help a total stranger if one should happen to die in your vicinity. You can say the phrases just given, but instead of saying the soul of so-and-so, you say the soul of the person here before me. There was a program on TV recently about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Did anybody see it? Yeah? Well, he said that every day, as part of his meditation, he practices for death. We can have no better example to follow than that of the Dalai Lama. Said enough now, and I'd like to conclude with some verses from the Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna is on the battlefield with Prince Arjuna, and he's telling Arjuna how it all is. Krishna says, "The wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. There was not any time when I was not, nor you, nor these princes of men, nor shall we ever cease to be. As the dweller in the body experiences childhood, youth, old age, so he passes on to another body. The steadfast one grieves not at that. He is not born, nor does he die, nor having been, ceases to be any more, unborn, perpetual, eternal, ancient. He is not slain when the body is slaughtered. The dweller in the body of everyone is ever invulnerable. Therefore you should not grieve for any creature." And finally, there is an excarnate entity called Emmanuel. He speaks through an American woman called Pat Rodegast, and Emmanuel was asked by an interested group to say something about dying and death. He said, "Tell them It's absolutely safe. It's like taking off a tight shoe. Thank you.